Good morning. Rabbi Barbara Thiede has long been a part of our Covenant faculty, and how exciting it is to have her here with us to finish up our season with the topic, All of David's Women. Her book, Rape Culture in the House of David, was released this week. I purchased it and am reading it, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested in the intersection of faith and toxic masculinity. And I believe we should all be interested in the topic. Rabbi Thiede, as you know, is a full-time professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, Department of Religious Studies, and also the spiritual leader of Temple or Olam in Charlotte. Rabbi, part of my usual task at this time is to say an opening prayer, and I confess I'm not a big believer in non-sectarian prayer. I think that we can respect and love siblings of other faith traditions without silencing the words that make our faith traditions particular, just in order to pray together. So let me just say on behalf of the Covenant class that we are blessed to have you with us today.
Good morning, everyone. So I want to say very briefly, just again to those of you who are new, that this is the second time this has happened, and it is a joy that it has. There's nothing like spending your birthday with people you love. So, happy birthday. There you go. Thank you. And, that also explains the red shoes. Because, you know, at some point we're old enough to be able to do that sort of thing. All right, this is a day when I am going to be absolutely barreling through a lot of material. But before I start, I had an email late last night from Mary, and she asked me an excellent question, which is, after you look at all of these horrific, toxic materials, and by the way, Mary, Gail Rubin is quoted in that book over there, so the Traffic in Women article has been pivotal for scholars in terms of understanding how to deal with these issues. And she asked a really interesting and important question, which I think what I will do is just add that on to the last day of this series. And that question is, once you get to addressing the toxic masculinity of these texts, how is it that your relationship with the Holy One of Blessing, as we call it in my tradition, changes, adjusts, is challenged? How do you pray to a God that this set of texts makes so unapproachable, so dangerous, and so frightening for women? So I'll try to answer that question on the third day. And today what I'm going to do is very quickly address first an important theoretical issue, which is how and why would I use the words rape culture to describe a biblical literature that is 2,000 to 2,500 years old. Before I do, I want to just start by making sure that we don't fall into supersessionist traps, right? That is a really important issue. As you already know, the New Testament itself is also filled with violence and suffering, and that is condoned by Jesus. So we have texts where Jesus says eyes should be plucked out and hands should be cut off as a result of sin. There are texts in which the earth is threatened with bloody violence, and I'm sure most of the world to bring peace to the earth. I come to bring not peace but a sword. So I want to indicate that we are dealing, as I said last week, in essence with the same God. And the same God has the same problems around violence and around women and around issues in both texts, as the same God also has the same assets of compassion and love and everlasting tenderness, because that also exists in our texts on both sides. So I want to start with retrojection. Retrojection is the evil word in all my classes at UNC Charlotte. You know, I'm always telling my students, retrojection, careful. No, there actually is no Satan in the Hebrew Bible, and no, there is no hell. Sexuality in a text that knows nothing of sexuality, right? That's a modern term. It comes from 1869. So I am, as a historian, someone who is constantly warning about the dangers of using modern terminology for ancient. However, I want to indicate to you that there's a reason to use the term rape culture, and so this time I'm violating what seem to be my own rules. In the introduction to rape culture in the House of David, I spend some time on this. I describe what the academic did, that first, texts have to be analyzed in their own context. It's a thought crime to retroject ideas. Don't do it. Second, there is no word for rape in the Hebrew Bible, and biblical writers don't understand the taking of a woman as an act of violence, but as a male right. Third, it is absolutely clear that the Hebrew Bible legislates what can be done sexually to access a woman's body. I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can look it up in Deuteronomy. There are plenty of them. Who you can access, what conditions. Women, fourth, have no right of consent in the Hebrew Bible. There's actually a scholar who says if there's no right to consent, then you cannot legally make the claim that rape exists, because consent as such is not a thing for these ancient writers. There are some scholars who think that rape does, occur in some of that claim to saying, well, you know for sure that it's rape if you have seen literally clear evidence that is without question of the use of physical violence along with the sexual. Or in one case, you have to have evidence of psychological trauma. My goodness, how many problems are with all of these things. I can see Mary shaking her head, and for very, very, very good reasons, right? The conclusions that then scholars come to is that Hebrew Bible ideas are completely different from our own about what constitutes sexual assault or rape, and for biblical writers, a man who accesses a woman on the wrong terms is in most cases not really guilty of rape, but guilty of or transgressive sex. That's how they'll put it. That's the work of Libke, who I write about. Contemporary readers then have to confine themselves, according to this view, to describing sexual violence in the biblical texts using the language of the authors. In other words, we can only call it what the writers call it, and we can only name it what they name and how they name. So, what are my arguments with this? I have many, as you can well imagine. Denying a woman power over any kind of consent is a defining feature of rape culture. Any culture which does not permit a woman to have the right to consent or not to consent is already starting in a place that constitutes rape culture. The lack of a term for rape in the Hebrew Bible is, in my view, coupled with the abundance of sexual violence in its pages, is actually evidence of a rape culture, not absence. I'll explain why in a little while. Biblical law and literature, from my perspective, actually sanction rape. In this world, rape is useful because it permits men to control other men through the threat of physical rape and acts of symbolic rape. The third chapter in that book is about male-on-male violence. It permits male characters to share, to assault, and to discard women's bodies in order to generate male alliances, male friendships, and male partnerships, a topic of both my first book and my second. So I just want to ask you to think about what culture is as a term. It is a term of resistance. It is a term of resistance. It was brought forward to fight the very issues that we still contend with. And I want you just to imagine for a moment that you live in a culture in which all manner of sexual violence exists. This kind of violence is depicted everywhere, in all of your media, in all of your artistic mediums. It'll find expression in the way that cisgender heterosexual white men and men of color will speak about women and their bodies in a wide range of settings. from their offices to Facebook to Twitter accounts. It is used to dehumanize people of color, and particularly women of color, and LGBTQ individuals. Children, the elderly, the poor, the disempowered are all working in a world in which this kind of languaging of sexual violence as permissible, as acceptable, as part and parcel of the culture is rife. And in this world, those who control others through toxic masculinity and misogynistic behaviors with sexual violence, with rape, with gang violence, and gang rape generally pay no price. And now, after you've imagined this culture, which is yours, that is your culture, ask yourself whether the purveyors of this culture, the mostly cisgender, heterosexual men who collude in making sexual violence acceptable and permissible everywhere, are likely to tell you, sure, I live in a rape culture. Just imagine the former president of the United States who talked about grabbing women by the pussy saying, yes, I live in a rape culture. The very people who have the power to do these things are not going to call themselves out as being members of a rape culture. It is minorities and women and those who have suffered from the culture who generally are the ones who are using that, call it a term, resistance. It is a term that says, no, look at what's going on. Please face what is happening. We need to name this, we need to claim this, and we need to change this. So it is, as it frequently is, the people who are oppressed, who are harmed, and who are hurt most, who use terms that call for change, that call for resistance. So for that reason, and for many, many others, not the least of which is to say that women have to be provably physically bruised, right? In the way that some of these scholars are saying you have to have physical evidence of real violence before you could call it rape, otherwise it might be transgressive sex. Or you have to have proof that that woman or that victim, whoever that might be, child, female, even male, has suffered emotionally before you can call it rape. All of this is the kind of thing that those scholars would never say about their own time, and about the women in their own time, and about the victims of rape in their own time. I believe that. They'd be called out immediately for saying that kind of thing, wouldn't they? Show me the bruises? Can you imagine? So for those reasons, and for so many others, and because I believe, as I said last week, that if we do not call out the toxicity in these texts, we can hardly claim to be calling it out in our own time. We have to see where it is. So for that reason, I want to speak to you about Bathsheba. Bathsheba, who has been so frequently the subject of art and movie and various media as a temptress, or as somebody who truly loved David and they had this romantic affair, you know, all of this work. Go, just Google art and Bathsheba and take a look at how she is represented and think about it. And think about it after today's lecture. I want to start with a really important premise. What happens to Michal and Bathsheba is not about either woman. It isn't. It's a man's story told to a male audience in a culture that values male honor, prestige, and power. Very much like our own. Women's bodies are used to establish or reestablish dominance, also like our own. And Saul, as you remember, uses Michal to try to ensure David's demise when he becomes too much of a challenge for Saul. And David will take Bathsheba just after he too has had his authority challenged. So men respond to challenges to their authority by using women's bodies as their authority in both. The rape of Bathsheba will involve an exhibitionist display of power. I say that slowly because it's often Bathsheba who is accused of exhibitionism, but it's actually David. It's David. And this will lead to murder not only of Uriah, but of other men who fight on behalf of David. And a host of men will be involved from the start, as they are in every story that I write about. Men who are hidden, men we don't notice, men we need to pay attention to. So the backstory. A backstory that people fail to notice. Where is David at this point in the story in 2 Samuel 11? What actually is his position by this time? Well, let's go through. He's conquered Jerusalem. He's acquired a lot of wives, a lot of what we call concubines. The word is a little bit but I'll speak about that next week. He's fathered a number of sons. He's retaken the Ark of the Covenant. He's brought it to the city of David, remember last week, in a holy exhibitionist display. And in chapter 8, we see him involved in the conquest and enslavement. Please notice these texts. Some of them are on your sheet, right? The enslavement of a number of peoples on a grand scale. He's subdued the Philistines. He's defeated the Moabites. He literally measures people out on who will live and who will die. I believe that text is on your... this one's working too? Yeah. Oh, I thought it was just this one. All right, I thought I didn't need that one. Thank you. All right, so is it better? Oh, I'm so sorry. My bad. It's the IT guy at my house who has to tell me these kinds of things. Right. So. All right. So what has happened by this point? At this point, we've had one people after another subdued, enslaved. I mean, when you're measuring people out to decide who's going to live and who's going to die, that's a pretty ugly scene, right? These are the kinds of things we forget, but they're in the text. Yeah, Edomites, all sorts of people end up in this situation after David goes on this conquering spree. And pivotally, David makes sure that the only surviving member of the house of Saul, Jonathan's crippled son Mephibosheth, is brought to his court and is made his dependent, right? So the only remaining member of the house of Saul is his, effectively, in a kind of a house arrest. What is the next piece of this? We have magnanimity gone wrong. The king of Ammon, Nahash, dies. And David, this is the chapter right before the taking of Bathsheba. David sends messengers to his son with his condolences. But the Ammonites, not for no reason, suspect David's courtiers of nefarious motives, and they warn Hanun, don't trust them, right? This is the man who has just conquered and enslaved so many numbers of people. He is not to be trusted. He might seem to be sending you condolences. Be careful. And as you can see on your handout, a couple of verses that I've included here, indeed, Hanun takes that warning seriously. And before David can possibly humiliate him or his people, he takes the initiative. He publicly shames David's messengers. You have to really think this through. Before his own court, he has one side of their beards cut off. Now, if you have the time, I highly recommend that you read a book by Cynthia Chapman on ancient Israel and Assyrian battle and battle imagery. I'll get you the title through John. She has a whole extended piece on the importance of the beard in the ancient world as signifying virility, and the ways in which being pulled by the beard or having the beard shaved off or having something happen to your beard, a symbolic way, effectively, I'll be blunt, to castrate a former enemy, right? A subdued enemy. It's one way to humiliate them utterly. And so half the beard is cut off, right? Which makes all of these messengers look foolish, and they've been publicly effectively attacked. And by the way, this whole issue of the beard standing in for male genitalia also shows up in rabbinic texts, so we know that this is a piece, right, of that culture. The other thing he does, equally as horrific, is he orders that their garments be cut away so their buttocks are exposed. So if their buttocks are exposed, what else is exposed, right? Again, this is a public humiliation of David's messengers. David has been given a warning. He has been shamed. He has been shamed in a public and awful way. So messengers are effectively emasculated, and we have a challenge to David's own masculinity and power. Once his messengers have been feminized in this way, their public appearance would demonstrate David's loss of prestige. Right? They can't be made to be seen in public. So, not unexpectedly, David orders them to stay away from the palace, from the court, and from Jerusalem. They're to remain in the city of Jericho until their beards grow back. And of course, as you might expect, war ensues, because there's been affront and insult. But here's an interesting moment. When that war begins, and when that war starts happening in chapter 10 and in the first line of chapter 11, David isn't the one who goes out to war in chapter 11. It's Joab. Now why? We have to think about that. Before we do, let me just reprise a claim that I made earlier. When David shames Saul by winning every battle, by gaining loyalty and love from the troops, by being the recipient of a display of female exuberance. Remember, all the women of Israel who dissed Saul's military achievements. Saul had his thousands, David had his 10,000s. Immediately, Saul's response is to use his daughters, use women, to capture and snare and effectively, by proxy, get David killed by the Philistines. So his response is to reassert his authority, reassert his power, and he uses the bodies of his daughters to do that, Michal most particularly. What's happening here? David's honor has been impugned, and he will immediately engage in a public display of his authority over a woman's body. And this will happen publicly. So, first, why does David not go out to this war? There is nothing in the text that makes clear why he abandons this war to Joab at the opening of 11, other than his immediate focus on Bathsheba. There's a point in my second book where I speculate maybe that is also an insult back to the king of Hanun. You are so unimportant that I'm going to send my general to deal with you, not me. Right? That if he goes out, he confirms the importance of what Hanun has done to him. If Joab does it, maybe not so much. I'm not sure. It's something we can think about. But it is true that David stays in Jerusalem and does a lot of royal napping and royal strolling. The text of the chapter 11 begins describing David getting up from his bed sort of late in the afternoon. You know, he's lazing around the palace, and he sees Bathsheba. And what is the first thing he does, right? Does anybody remember? He sends to find out who is that woman, which means he is asking some man to find out from other men who that woman is. Right? So we've already, step one, it's not secretly that he's asking who she is. Step two, a servant shows up, stands by him, and the Hebrew, which you will not see on this text, but which is there, says effectively a question. The servant says, isn't that Bathsheba? Right? Isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a foreigner, by the way, right? Isn't that Bathsheba? We need to think about whether it was a practice among the men of this court to see or watch Bathsheba. Think about it. Isn't that Bathsheba? I just want to point that out. Somebody knows her, somebody's seen her, people have witnessed her. Somehow she is already known to David's servants. Cheryl Exum writes, a woman is touching herself and a man is watching. The viewing is one-sided, giving him the advantage and the position of power. He sees her, but she does not see him. And I want to point out, as I do in my book, at least 2 men are watching a woman touch herself. That experience is shared. So there's a little homosociality going on here. This is something that comes up a lot in my first book, but also my second one. How often are men sharing an experience sexually in these texts? Amnon, by the way, has, as we'll find next week, has a host of people watching the prelude to his rape of his half-sister. Right? A host of men are in the room. So the viewers here, I want to also point out, do not only include the male characters of the text, they include the male author who's writing it, his biblical audience, who is probably largely male, and generations of readers that follow. And I'm going to be blunt about it. There's a kind of illicit, vicarious pleasure in taking a woman's clothes off without her knowledge. And we know that from popular culture. There are people who blame Bathsheba in this moment. But I really want to point out, David is standing above her and looking down at her together with at least one servant. Those kinds of actions align with the very premises of rape culture that assume that women are asking for the sexual attention or even sexual violence that men force upon them. So I'm not buying that premise, that she knows, that we have evidence that she knows. There is absolutely no indication in the text that she is attempting to seduce the king. There is nothing in the text that suggests that. And in fact, later in the text, she is not blamed, David is blamed. And believe me, Hebrew Bible texts are pretty quick to blame women if they've done something inappropriately. So I think that that's important, because the male writer is not interested in blaming her. He's interested in this male story of power. I also want to point out that kings in this culture and in these texts get to call for women when they want them. Remember Ahasuerus, right? Can actually have the capability of having young virgins from every part of his province brought to him for his sexual use, right? That's the world that we are looking at in the ancient Near East, and we know of powerful men who have all sorts of young women brought to them for their use. I don't even need to say the names, you know them already. Some of them. I want to point out that nothing here is done in secrecy. Nothing is going on in the dark of night. We have a masculine power display before both courtiers and servants. David has established his interest in a woman who belongs to one of his men, one of his 30 most companions. Very roof from David observed Bathsheba by Absalom. That'll be next week's material. So he may not be raping her that publicly, but it's close, because think about it, every man of the court knows or can see or might be aware that Bathsheba has been sent for, that Bathsheba has been brought. This is not happening secretly. Every man in this court who knows what's happened here can know that David has taken Bathsheba to his rooms, and every man can imagine why. It's Bathsheba who may not know why she's called. Some of my students say, does she think that he's calling her to the palace because Uriah is dead? And I said, we don't know what she's thinking. But there are plenty of reasons to assume that she has no idea why, and I can tell you honestly, when a king calls you to the palace, you go. Bathsheba is thus, like Michal was, encircled. She's encircled by David, his courtiers and servants, all of whom are collaborating and cooperating for it to be possible for David to both take her. Is going to deal with the fallout later. A company of men is surrounding Bathsheba. I want to point out that the text where it says he sends for her, she comes, right? First of all, the word lakach, to take, when it's used with the word isha, a woman, inevitably is describing a base act, an act that is not considered according to the law. Secondly, the she came to him is quite likely a later insertion. It doesn't show up in the Septuagint. It doesn't show up in other ancient sources. It is possible the later author is trying to make it look more volitional on her part, but I do want to indicate, even if it wasn't an addition, that she came to him is still no expression of volition, right? If you are not the king, you don't determine what the king gets to do. So what happens, right? As you know, Bathsheba gets pregnant. Also, there's a text here where I describe her cleaning herself. This is frequently described as she was cleaning herself from menstrual impurity. That's silly. It's just silly that scholars even got bought into this piece, because first of all, menstrual impurity doesn't get cleaned by bathing in the Hebrew Bible. It's a passage of time. That's all. The whole idea of bathing and going to, for example, a mikvah after menstrual cycles is a rabbinic idea. So that's a place where something really has been retrojected inappropriately. But I do want to ask you, what is the first thing women do who have been raped? I can see some people nodding heads. This is such a powerful instinct that if you go online and you ask, you Google, what should I do if I've been raped? One of the very first things that websites will say is don't shower, don't wash, because you'll be washing away the evidence. The hardest thing to do is not to get to the shower, not to go and wash. And what is Bathsheba doing? Washing. Now, this is not necessarily in the mind of the biblical author. It is possible that the biblical author is implying that she's trying to avoid pregnancy by washing. I don't know. But I do want to say that it's important that we not retroject why she is washing, and we at least leave it open to the message to today's victims of rape, because that part of the text is a way for us to say, we get it, we understand, right? And sometimes these texts can be used to heal, even the worst of these texts. So, what happens in the fallout? David calls Uriah back to the city, and he tells him, he wines him, he dines him, and he says, go down to your house and bathe your feet. And he sends a little gift after him, a little gift, probably some wine and flowers and food. What is David trying to do? We know what David is doing. Bathsheba's pregnant, he's trying to cover it up, right? Because he might get away with taking a woman, but getting away with having a child on a woman might be a step too far for her husband, and that might cause problems politically among men and about the support for him. Uriah is told, go down and bathe his feet. Feet is a euphemism in Hebrew often for the male genitalia. What is David saying? Ha ha ha, go down and have sex with your wife, right? Like, it's a male moment here where they talk, where they drink. He says, go off and have fun. You're away from duty. And Uriah doesn't do it. Uriah goes and sleeps with the men, right, at the entrance of the court. And so again, every man who's there, why isn't he with his wife? What kinds of rumors might be going on? What might be said? Maybe Uriah himself has heard something. Again, none of this has happened secretly. Maybe he knows he's being played, because his response is effectively, how can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this. Seems like he knows something is up. He puts it in soldierly terms, right? My men are out in the field, Joab is out in the field, I can't do this kind of enjoying. But what kind of thing can he say to the king? You can't really say, you know, I know what's happened. I'm not going to cover up your problem. What happens? You know, you can imagine some scenario in which David and Uriah might have enjoyed the fantasy of sharing a woman. It does happen in 2 Samuel 13 that Amnon and Jonadab do exactly that. They enjoy the fantasy of Tamar being used sexually by Amnon together, and they plan it together, as we'll see next week. But not here. To do that, you have to have assent on both sides, and he doesn't have it. David took Bathsheba without such assent, and Uriah is not going to be urged on to have sex with his wife by the very man who has cuckolded him. David tries again to get him drunk, and it still doesn't work. And then he sends Uriah off with a letter to Joab that demands that he be executed. So Uriah is sent with the letter that confirms how he's going to die. He doesn't know it. That's power, right? He delivers the letter to Joab that he is going to be executed, and just as Abner facilitated the taking of Michal from Paltiel, as we saw last week, Joab now facilitates David's acquisition of Bathsheba and sets almost as David intended. David wants Uriah in a place where he will surely die. Does this sound like Saul? Right? Where Saul wants David in a place where he will surely die, and Joab knows that if Uriah is the only one to die, it's going to look pretty bad. There's only so much bad political press you can handle here. So what does Joab do? Something which is truly extraordinary, and we must consider. He sends a number of men to the walls with Uriah, and a number of David's men are going to die for David's taking and raping of Bathsheba, not just Uriah. A number of men are going to die for this. And then Joab sends back a messenger, and when the messenger tells David that a number of your men have died, then the messenger is specifically directed to be very explicit and say, and oh, by the way, Uriah was there and he died with them. So that David won't be upset at losing so many men. And basically, David isn't too upset. Oh, the sword devours, he says. I get it. What a price to pay. How many men have been involved now? There's David. There's the servants. There's even, if you consider it, the servant that Bathsheba sent to tell David that she was pregnant. So somebody else also knows that. How many men at the court know? We don't know. Does Uriah know? Seems like he might. Does Joab know? There is a massive, extraordinary display of power on David's part, and there is a massive collusion, collaboration, and cooperation to make sure he gets away with it. I just want to emphasize this so that you read this through. In today's world, if a woman was brought to a powerful man at his command, and in order for him to use her body sexually, what would be your response? Would even modern-day scholars, upon hearing or reading about women, children, and men in our world who have been moved from one location to another so a powerful man can use their bodies sexually, would they regard this as harmless erotic play? And yet, that kind of romanticizing, that kind of illusion has been built around descriptions of this narrative, coupled with regarding Bathsheba as an enticer, a seducer, and a loose woman. It is nothing short of astonishing that we ever continue to claim a narrative that permits men to eyeball a woman without her knowledge, to strip her, to take her, and to rape her, and then have the effrontery to blame her for their behavior. So how many men were involved? Who doesn't get involved in making this story end well for David? That's my question for you. And now, time for your questions for me. We've got it this time, yay. So we have a microphone which will pass around to people, and that way everybody can hear the questions. And if you need to take a minute just to breathe, I understand. Oh, gosh.
No, it's a friendly question, but
It's not always.
would you explain why anybody would bathe on a roof to begin with?
I'm sorry?
Would you explain why anybody would bathe on a roof to begin with?
Yes, I will explain that. That is a friendly question. I mentioned this also in my book, because many people go, "Oh, what you doing bathing in public like that?" Well, actually, in ancient Israel, houses are built. Go to look at Deuteronomy. It's a law that you have to have a wall like around the roof. Rooftops, this is a country in which not a whole lot of natural water is available, and so people collect water, and they collect them on the roofs. This is true of different places in the ancient Near East. Even Hammurabi's code also has this rule about having like a fence or a wall around the top of a square roof, and in fact, in Hammurabi's code, the architect who doesn't include it can get like executed, right? It's that serious. So it's partially because people might fall off, right? It's a thing around safety. So water is collected, probably washing is done on the roof, probably sleeping is done in the roof in, certain kinds of hot times of the year. Remember Rahab, who has her, the spies sleeping on the roof. So from Bathsheba's perspective, right, she's on the roof, but she's encircled by a wall, right? There's some kind of impediment to seeing her, right? It's not on her mind, I imagine, that somebody way up above is going to be watching her, right? We don't necessarily think of that kind of thing. So, we have to keep in mind that from her perspective, what she's doing is normative, even appropriate. She's bathing where there's water that's been collected. Thank you for that question. It was a good one. There's a question way back. Way back.
I'm sorry, I can't remember the number of the psalm, but the remorse that David shows, I gather that that's more for the death of Uriah than for what he did to Bathsheba.
David's remorse. First of all, the psalm that is alleged to be is,
well, it's very, very guilt-ridden.
Right. So first of all, there's no evidence David wrote that psalm. There's no evidence that David wrote any of these psalms. And I think that that's a kind of attribution that is done later, just in the same way that the Song of Songs is frequently called the Song of Solomon. This is talking about that moment when Nathan comes in and does the whole parable about the sheep, and he says, that one dude, right, he should be punished fourfold. I have actually an article in the works about this whole piece, and then Nathan says, "You're the man." There is actually no specific evidence that he shows remorse for the taking of Bathsheba. If there is a punishment that he endures, it is also indicative in the text that when the deity punishes him in chapter 12, it is circling around that he took a woman from another man and that man was executed. So it's not about the taking of Bathsheba in its own space. It's about the fact that he took Bathsheba from another man, and there isn't even an indication that that's as serious, as scholars have pointed out, for the Israelite deity as the sheer execution of Uriah, right? It makes him look bad, anyway, to have his king executing his loyal followers in quite this way. But it appears textually to be more around the death of Uriah than even the taking of Bathsheba. And we do want to remember that this deity himself is not above moving women around. And that is a subject, by the way, in Malignant Fraternities, especially 2 chapters in the second half. This deity says in that very section, I gave you your master's wives. In chapter 12, he says that. I gave you your master's wives, and look what you're doing. So the deity himself is capable of saying, all right, these women actually now belong to you, and that's fine. So taking women when you are either God, king, or a patriarch from other men is not particularly condemned. Yeah, the deity acts in a way kind of as a model, and in my 3rd book I'm going to be looking really closely at these kinds of issues, the issues of what is the, how the deity acts the man is the short, because the deity is the model for masculinity. Of course, he should be in Hebrew Bible. So, I'm sorry, bad news on David's remorse.
I'm curious.
Oh, we've got 2 in that
Sorry,
line.
I didn't even.
All right.
Sorry.
Wonderful.
I'm curious about how they decided who was going to live and who was going to die with the Moabites when they measured them out. Yeah, what was the factor there?
All the text says is they measure them out, and he decides who lives and who dies. So does he take the tall ones pardon me, the measuring of the people who are going to be your slaves is often based on their size and their strength. I'm guessing that that's operative here. Yeah, we really want to think about that, how we measure people who are going to be your slaves. Ouch.
Shifting gears, much of what you have said indicates that women have no influence and power in various things. My curiosity is the number of women who seem to be perfectly happy with that. And there are a remarkable... You mean in our
time or in biblical times?
Either one. In our times, I know that of such people. I don't know about biblical times. That's a question, I guess. Right.
So I first want to say the biblical times is kind of a problem, right? That's why I usually use the word biblical literature. This is literature written by a certain small elite group of men, and it's largely for a male audience. And one of the things that we discover, which is the good news, you would like some good news from me, right? So some good news is that the archaeological record, if you had Carol Myers here in front of you, one of my favorite colleagues whose work I read all the time, she's a famous archaeologist and biblical scholar at Duke. And what she discovers is evidence of women's interaction, power, both social, economic, and even political power from the archaeological record that seems to work in contrast to biblical texts. So we might be having in these biblical texts a bunch of men who are writing about how they think things ought to be, not how things are or were, right? So that is a constant thing that we should have in our minds, right? Like whether this was real lived religion is a whole different question. Okay, so women being happy in our times with the conditions of a toxic masculinity. I don't know that I really am able to make a coherent statement about that, because if you are born into a system which prescribes your roles and tells you what should make you happy and what ought to make you happy, then you are not in a blank slate situation, right? And often I find that it is only the realization of how things could be that make you realize what is. And I say this now, and I'm going to give a personal example. My daughter-in-law is of Korean birth, but was born and raised in Paraguay and brought to this country at the age of 10. She's out on this, so I can say so. She was a DACA child. And in the world that she was brought to, where she excelled in her school, where she believed she was going to be able to go to any university she wanted, where she thought she had the freedom of every other American child, and when she only found out that she was 16, that she was not legally permitted to do those things, right? That was a crushing, awful realization. And the last 5 years I have known her has been an ongoing struggle to discover what might be hers, what could be hers, what should have been hers, and what should be the inheritance of every child in this country. And only then has the work been done for her on what was, and what constrained her, and what oppressed her. So I think to some extent that is operative for every person who is living in a position where they do not have control, power, and authority over their own actions and lives. And really, I could have used myself as an example too, right? When I was born, girls were supposed to be teachers, nurses, or secretaries. This is why I didn't learn to type until I was in my 50s, right? And I've written like a lot of stuff. I was three-fingering it because I didn't want to take the course to be a secretary in junior high school that I was offered, right? You know, the typing course. And what has that taken, like, for me to come to a place where I can consistently, continuously say to my own female students, stop the disclaimers, where they start every question, well, this might be a foolish question, or I don't know if I'm right, but it's my female students who do that, not my male students. Why? Because they've been taught. They've been taught to disclaim, right? So the systems that we are born into are influential in how we determine where we are, what we need, and what we can do. I guess I did try to answer that question. And there's another question right over there.
Look at the Me Too movement that have brought so many men down in the last few years.
Yes, not enough. And one of the things that I want to, I'm going to be clear about this. I myself have been involved in 2 Title IX cases in the last 3 years. One at my seminary, one at the university. And the one at the university involved somebody who had been sexually harassing women for decades at UNCC. And we had a history where when women tried to report it on an annual evaluation, they were told by a male dean, you can't write this down. Yeah. So, my friends, one of the biggest problems that still continues is whether you're allowed to talk about it. Am I allowed to talk about it? Am I endangering myself by talking about it? If this person finds out that I'm talking about it, even though I haven't named this person, will I be the victim of some kind of civil suit, right? What can we say without endangering ourselves? What positions? Women in academia make up 75% of the non-tenure track, the contract workers, right? Women of color and women generally are so powerless to name the amount of sexual harassment that goes on at our workplace because we could lose our jobs over it. Like, that, is that still a thing? And the only way that we managed this Title IX thing to its end is because we had 4 women and 1 man who testified, right? If it had been 1 woman, and because the university, for a new change, didn't separate out all the complaints, which is the typical way that companies and God knows what else do. They separate out the complaints and then they say, oh, well, that one doesn't really rise to a seriousness, and that one doesn't rise to seriousness. That's what happened at my seminary. We had 5 complainants, but they were all taken separately. None of it rose to seriousness that constituted some kind of consequence, and the guy's off scot-free. It helps that he has lawyers, and he's very, very well, very, very well, and could threaten the ethics committee with a lot of legal stuff. However, the fact that the Me Too movement has existed at all has been a significant step forward. That is the good news. It is real, right? When women could say Me Too, and men. 1 out of 6 men in this country, 1 out of 6 men, statistically, is the victim of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Just naming that. 1 out of 6.
How do you deal with a deity as a woman that is apparently subjectively suppressing you?
Toxic. Absolutely toxic. As my third book is the deity who mumbles, fumbles, grumbles, and does all sorts of like ugly stuff. Yeah, that was Mary's question when she wrote to me an email about this. I'll give you a spoiler alert for next week about this. Surprise. There is no Jew who is praying to the deity of the Hebrew Bible. And there is no Christian who is praying exactly to the deity of Hebrew Bible or New Testament. We thankfully, gratefully, have interpreted our God. We have made choices about how to interpret our God. I will speak more about this next week in real detail. But honestly, could I be wearing that? Could I be doing the work I did and then say, yeah, this is the God I'm praying to? Heck no. I'd be walking. I'd be running the opposite direction. But I will say more about that next week, I promise.
Rabbi Barber, we look forward to next week, and thank you for your courage and your honesty and sharing of your personal story, making this so real for us. Thank you.
I am very grateful to be here. I know there was one person with one last question, so what we can do is...
I'm sorry. Okay, and then...
It's all right. Maybe one last question?
Yeah, just really quick. Could you speculate on the remainder of Bathsheba's life? How was she treated? What likely could have happened to her?
Bathsheba's life?
Yes.
Bathsheba's life is very, very complicated. She does show up again in relationship to her son Solomon. There's a really interesting exchange that she has with Solomon over the fate of another woman. In a weird way, Bathsheba I have to think about this a little bit more, does something a little bit like Sarah does. In other words, Sarah, who has been effectively taken by Pharaoh and sexually used by Pharaoh. That's in the text. He says he took her. Later inflicts a lot of rage and discontent on Hagar. And I've been wondering myself what Bathsheba does with this other woman that is a point of contention between Solomon and one of David's other sons is a sort of similar thing. In other words, do you hand on your trauma to another woman? Sometimes. Yeah. And now I suppose we should be closing, right?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, too.
On.
Anything?